as well, which covers the Brownsville areas. The Councilman Esplanade covers East New York areas. We're also joined by JP Patifio, TWU Local 100, Adriana Espinosa, New York League of Conservative Voters, Conservation Voters. She's in route also. And Lucy Caton from Transportation Alternative is also here with us. And we're really responding to the report that was released yesterday in the New York Daily News that talked about the apparent inequities in how buses are assigned throughout the city. We specifically want to drill down on Brownsville and East New York, two of the poorest residence areas in the city. Based on what we read, the poorest residents in the city are getting and receiving the oldest buses. I had conversation this morning with members of the authority, and that was a clear statement that came out of the conversation. The fact is that the oldest buses and the buses in Brownsville are older than the citywide average. That's troubling to me. And there's a clear desire to move forward in the future on improving on these inequities and having a better use of buses, but that still doesn't answer the question of what happened in the past. And we cannot only say let's move forward without doing a review and a proper analysis of how did we get here? How do we have a transportation system where the poorest community has the oldest buses? That question mark needs to be answered. According to the Daily News report, 17 bus routes serve East New York or Brownsville. The average age of the vehicles running on 9 of those lines is more than 10 years. When you look at areas such as Park Slope, Williamsburg, and Greenpoint, where residents' incomes average twice that of the people on the eastern end of Brooklyn, they have 17 routes within their borders. Just 3 routes in those neighborhoods have buses 10 years or older. So a clear analysis on the face states that the area where the income is twice as much as Brownsville and East New York, they have the newer buses. I believe it should be the other way around. The area where you have the poorest economic indicators, they should be the first to receive the quality service and buses that we desire. The average age of the New York City fleet is 9.2 years. So this is a clear inequity that has to be rectified, and I am pushing to make sure that we do just that. And this is more than just a conversation about poor communities receiving a lack of quality bus services. This is about feeding into the narrative that many people in this city that live in economically challenging communities don't believe government is giving them the same level of services that a more economically affluent communities receive. The older buses are disproportionately dirtier. The newer buses are better. The older buses spew out diesel fuel, and this is important when you look at the areas that we're talking about. Brownsville and East New York, the Department of Health numbers are clear. Children age 5 to 17 in East New York and Starrett City area, they have 315 child asthma emergency department visits per 10,000 children, compared to 113, 50% less, more than 50% less per 10,000 children in Park Slope and Carroll Gardens. Yet Park Slope and Carroll Gardens buses are better and more environmentally friendly than the ones in Brownsville. But it's even more troublesome when you look at Brownsville. Brownsville, you have an even worse number, 475 child asthma emergency department visits per 10,000 children. These numbers are horrific. And Government should not be feeding the crisis. They should be operating to rectify the crisis. Based on these numbers, it's just the opposite. This is why we're calling on both the New York City Council and the state legislators to do a forensic examination and determine, how did this happen? How did we get here where we have the oldest buses in the poorer part of the city? Is this an accident? Is this a poor administrative tactics, or was this intentional? And if it was intentional, those who are responsible should be held responsible for the action. Too often we see inequities in our society and we find it difficult to point our fingers on them. And that's why far too many people have surrendered in believing that government is for them, as it is throughout the entire city. These oversight hearings must determine whether this inequity was deliberate, and if so, what appropriate action should be taken. But I want to be clear. Accountability to this and supporting the MTA financial issues and matters and moving forward is not mutually exclusive. The way out of this crisis is not to stand and stop halfway. We have to go through this crisis completely. And that's why we strongly support the Fast Forward plan to expand high-quality electric and clean bus options to all New Yorkers. It is time to properly fund the TA. But the call is not to fund the TA and for the TA to continue to move in a direction where you do not have transportation equity and environmental equity. We want to be clear on that. The TA must get the money to move an extensive overhaul of our bus operation, but it should not be carried out in the manner in which we are witnessing now. And according to the numbers from the Transportation Alternative, places like Latrice Walker's district in Brownsville, they are public transportation dependent. Many of these communities, without transportation, they are unable to carry out their daily functions. In Latrice Walker's district in Brownsville, 70% of the residents commute by public transportation. Roxanne Prasad, the senator, 54% of her constituents rely upon public transportation. Assemblyman Barron's district, covering East New York, 65% of his residents rely upon public transportation. And State Senator Myrie's district, 67% of his residents rely on public transportation. The problem is, these are the same districts that we are talking about that have the older buses. And when you compound that with these communities need the transit investment, and they also are the communities that have the highest number of asthma and other health-related issues. They bear the disproportionate health and quality of life impacts and matters, and the transportation system should not contribute to that. So yes, we need to fully fund Fast Forward, bring state-of-the-art transportation. Brownsville would like to have Wi-Fi just like Park Slope. Brownsville would like to have diesel-free buses just like Williamsburg and Greenpoint. Brownsville would like to move into the 21st century just like other locales. Problems that we have viewed far too often is systemic racism, if it's premeditated, accidental, or just a misapplication of the resources of this city. The reality is we have newer buses in the poorer, in the affluent part of the city, and we have buses that are older in the poorer parts of the city. That fact is wrong. That should not be the case. And as we roll out the new buses, as we roll out the new technology, as we roll out more healthy ways of using transportation, we must start in the areas with the higher needs. You don't start in the areas who are more affluent. And today, as we speak, the fact is, Brownsville, a poorer part of the city, is receiving the oldest buses in comparison to the counterpart of the more affluent part of the city. That is a fact that we cannot deny, and that is a fact that we cannot ignore. And it is unacceptable and it is intolerable. And the only way we can find out how did we get here is by allowing the legislative bodies in this city on the state and city level to determine what were the facts that led to this circumstance that we are in now. And so I want to thank TWU Local 100 for joining us. And at this time, I think it's so important to hear from the bus riders, the bus drivers, those who are operating the systems, to be our eyes and ears to ensure that we have a fair, equitable system in the city. So I want to bring up JP Patafio, TWU Local 100. JP?
Thank you. I just want to make it very clear we stand by Borough President Adams. What he laid out, he hit it spot on. And wherever there are inequities, the Transport Workers Union Local 100 is going to be with the Borough President, making sure that those inequities get taken away. It's just, it should not happen. As far as the buses go, yes, we have a very old fleet, and they are disproportionately in East New York. That needs to change. It's not good for the riding public. It's not good for the operators. It's just something that shouldn't be taking place in a transit system that's ranked #1 in the nation. It also cries for funding. A lot of times we look at subways, but the fact is buses serve the more needier parts of New York. And buses don't get the high-profile attention that subways do. And if you have buses that are so old and they're being put in the poorest neighborhoods, that's wrong. So we need the funding, and then once we get the funding, we need to make sure that the poorest neighborhoods are served first, and the wealthiest neighborhoods get last. So we're just here with Borough President Adams, and whatever he needs to do, we will be supporting him.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's John Paul, but you can say JP Patafio, P-A-T-A-F-I-O, and the Vice President for Brooklyn Buses.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have one of the areas that was mentioned in the article was the Brownsville's area of Brooklyn. We have a representative from Councilwoman Alika Ampry-Samuel's office.
Hello everyone, my name is Cynthia Moises. I am here on behalf of Councilwoman Alika Ampry-Samuel. Councilwoman Alika Ampry-Samuel represents the 41st Council District, which includes Ocean Hill, Brownsville, East Flatbush, Crown Heights, and Bedford-Stuyvesant. I want to thank the Borough President Adams and TWU for inviting us to be here, but also for speaking to the needs of the community and speaking to the fact that our community, specifically Brownsville, which has been impacted by this, needs buses. I have a small quote from the councilwoman herself that I would just like to read in response to the recent article that had came out. And she states, "It is not a surprise that MTA would place the worst buses in Brooklyn's poorest neighborhoods. With the disproportionate number of old diesel-burning buses in Brownsville, the MTA is contributing to the health risk factors like so many other government entities. Our communities are constantly being disrespected with inadequate, poor quality services that attribute to poor health conditions." And so that is a quote that was released by the council member. Thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. And we also have joining us advocates on behalf of the transportation system, transportation alternative, Ms. Canton.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dulcie Canton. I'm the Brooklyn organizer for Transportation Alternatives. Thank you, Borough President Adams, for calling this press conference. We read the report this weekend and we're devastated. I mean, these are lower income communities of color. A lot of times many people have to walk to the subway, so if you can't walk, you need a bus. These buses, we did a research online. The B-15, which goes to East New York, Daily ridership, 19,827 people. The average age of their buses are 11 years old, whereas the B69 in Park Slope, 4,308 daily riders, and the average age of their buses are five years old. They're diesel buses, they're noisy, the ADA accessibility is hard to access. A lot of times the bus don't even lift and lower. This has to improve, and we have to fix these communities first. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And we also are joined by Adriana Espinosa, New York League of Conservation Voters. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Adriana Espinosa. I'm the New York City Program Director at the New York League of Conservation Voters. I'd like to thank Borough President Adams for holding this press conference, TW Local 100, Transportation Alternatives for being here. As our report highlighted last fall, the detrimental public health and environmental impacts of diesel emissions, and we know that disproportionately low-income communities and communities of color are overburdened by this poor air quality. And this weekend's Daily News analysis found that much of the MTA's older, dirtier buses are driving around in these communities that are already overburdened. Plain and simple, this is environmental injustice in action. And these diesel emissions adversely impact air quality and put the health of New Yorkers at risk. Diesel exhaust is made up of harmful pollutants, notably nitrous oxides and particulate matter. That's the tiny particles of dust that gets into our lungs and can get into our bloodstream. And the numerous studies have linked this exhaust to asthma and other respiratory diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and higher mortality rates. And in Brownsville specifically, the concentration of this particulate matter is higher than both the citywide and the borough average. And nearly 375,000 people suffer from asthma in New York City, a major proportion of which are in these environmental justice communities. And Brownsville has the highest adult asthma rate, and it is more than twice as high as the Brooklyn average and the citywide average. The same is true for children. Asthma is the leading cause of school absences in New York City, and children with severe asthma can sometimes miss up to 30 days of school in a school year, putting a burden on their academic progress, on the families who have to maybe miss work to take care of their children. And again, in Brownsville and East New York, the rate of childhood asthma is nearly double the citywide and the borough rate. Getting more electric buses on the road is a feasible and healthy solution. No one should have to breathe in these dangerous pollutants. And given the harmful environmental and public health impacts, the transition is more critical now than ever. Last year, the MTA's Fast Forward plan called for all zero emissions, fully electric bus fleet. And we need congestion pricing now to fund Fast Forward so that we can rapidly increase this transition to a zero emissions fleet and fix our ailing subway system. And as others have said today, we echo that this electrification should start in the environmental justice communities in New York City, particularly East New York and Brownsville, where for these decades-old buses have been polluting the community, and a transition would make the biggest difference. These cleaner alternatives are available, and the time to transition is now. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Well said, and it is extremely important that we zero in that this is a transportation issue and this is an environmental issue. These communities cannot continue to miss the bus on healthy living and economic stability. No matter how we look at it, the older buses are in the poorer communities. The future, we're hoping that change. But right now, we need to answer the question, how did that happen? And we cannot ignore that question. We cannot talk about what we're gonna do in the future until we make sure we find out what happened now. How did we end up with the poorer communities receiving the dirtier buses? Because if we don't rectify that, when we put the money in the system with Fast Forward, when we make the transformation to electric buses, when we change what we're doing now, if we don't start in those communities with higher and greater needs, then we're back where we started from. This should not have happened. The MTA and the TA must do better. And we need answers, and we're calling on both the City Council and the state legislators to have a forensic examination of how did we get to where we are today. If it wasn't for the article in the Daily News, I don't know what type of response we would have received. We're open to any questions if you have any at this time. Thank you. I'm sorry, hold on one moment. Is that over the course of the past year? Right, the asthma number.
So that comes from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's community health profiles from last year.
Okay, so that's those are 2018 numbers. Okay, Councilman, why don't you join? Councilman Espinal just walked up.
What's up, sir? It's good to see you, man.
Yes, sir.
Oh, great. All right. Well, first and foremost, I really want to thank the Borough President for shedding light on this very, very serious issue. And I say serious because it's a historical problem. And over, communities like East New York and Brownsville continue to get short end of the stick. This is not only an MTA issue. Agencies across the board, when they implement great new programs that have a positive impact on communities across the board, oftentimes leave neighborhoods like East New York behind. But what we're seeing here is a problem that I believe is worse because of the environmental impact, but also the health impact it's having on residents of my communities. We talk about the asthma rates. We talk about other respiratory issues that people in communities of color often face. And what we're seeing here is an agency clearly putting some of the worst buses in our neighborhoods instead of doing the right thing and making sure that we have healthy communities in East New York and Brownsville. I have been calling for the MTA to make an expeditious switch to electric buses for years. And the reason I made that call is because diesel buses have had a negative impact on our environment, but also the toxic air and fumes that they produce in North Brooklyn have been contributing factor to some of the worst air quality that city has to offer. And it's time we make that switch. It's time that we catch up with the times. Other cities have been doing it, and it's the right thing to do in the name of climate justice and environmental racism, especially in neighborhoods of color like East New York. So I stand with the Borough President, I stand with the activists, and call the MTA do right by our communities, and also for the City Council to have an oversight hearing and to kind of see why this has been going on for so long and why we haven't been making a real effort in making sure that neighborhoods are getting the proper resources they need to deal with these issues. So thank you, Mr. Borough President, for all the work you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No other question?
Thanks.
All right.
All right. Wow. Good to see you too. All right, then.
Let us know anything you need, all right?
Yeah, listen, you want to definitely talk about
All right, I got a bunch of more deep.
Okay.
Keep going.
Thank you.